Hello world of YouTube and welcome to the Soundgarden Discography review. While I don't necessarily need an excuse to talk about Soundgarden because they are a band I've loved, I figured I would keep on the trend I've done with the last couple in particular on covering bands and artists that won't be making music anymore while I work on scripting all of the proverbial other format discography reviews, re-ranking new albums into current discographies I've ranked and the like, and it's a list that continues to grow as the years have gone on. I won't strictly be doing older acts or acts that are disbanded, but I will be focusing on that for at least a little while, and hopefully throughout next year I can get, a little more caught up, so to speak. That being said, Soundgarden are, at least currently at this point in my life, my favorite band to burgeon out of the grunge scene in the 90s. It's always been either them or Alice in Chains, but I just think, and maybe it's because I've been, listening to their discography for this video, they've just got an incredible legacy that they left behind. Obviously Chris Cornell's passing is the reason why the band isn't doing anything anymore, and he's an iconic vocalist with just such a really good use of power behind such great melody. You can feel a Robert Plant influence in him that I think he just harnesses into his own beast masterfully. But he's not the only talent in the band, obviously. I think Kim Thayil is a gargantuan guitarist that has a good balancing act of psychedelia and grunge that I think he creates these really good riffs with. I think that Matt Cameron is an incredible drummer. He knows how to add scale and chaos whenever needed in the groove. And I think that both Hiro Yamamoto and Jason Everman do a good job to complement that groove and add even more power to the song when needed. I think that they are just a really great batch of musicians. And I think that in their 6-record catalog, there isn't a stinker in the midst, but I will be today ranking those 6 albums from least to most favorite, along with telling you why, and giving you a sort of roadmap for getting into Soundgarden if you haven't listened to them and you would like to. I will also be talking about the one real significant EP they dropped in their career in just a moment. Before I get into that, be sure to give this video a like if you're excited to hear me talk about Soundgarden. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and let's go ahead and talk about that EP, which is called So their first 2 EPs, Screaming Life and Fop, are separate in their own regard. They were released at least like 6 to 8 months apart from each other, but in the modern age, a lot of DSPs and stuff lump them together. They were re-released as one bulk entity. And apart, they aren't too dissimilar from each other. They are both 2 releases where the band is cutting their teeth more than they are on their debut album, and I feel like there's some moments where that Zeppelin influence that they have really shines amid some of the more psychedelic leans that this does take. But even in that breath, those psychedelic leans don't quite have the same wash and texturing and wild sort of ambience that occurs even on Ultra Mega OK. I will say, while I do love hearing a band that I love cut their teeth to, and I think that like Screaming Life out of the 2 I prefer more because it's at least got some songs that I enjoy. I love the flirtations with some sick, sleek riffage like on Entering. Nothing to Say is like the closest bridge between that influence and where they take it on this album, really reaching a peak. The washing of that away into Little Joe is a nice little moment as well. Plus, Hand of God is also another moment that I feel like really sort of like weaves some seeds that they would very much double down on and explore further on records like Bad Motorfinger. It's just a nice little like introduction to them. Fop I like less just because there's less going on, and I think that like it's a bit too brief, but I still think that like it's a nice little oddity to check out if you're getting into the band and you want to hear them really sort of like hammer through finding a sound that really works for them across a couple of releases. I really don't have anything too negative to say about them, but out of like this lane of like early bands cutting their teeth, it's very much still in the same vein as other bands. It's a nice treat for fans, but I wouldn't say anything on it is wholly necessary to really invest into to get a lot of enjoyment at the band. But in that same breath, I don't think that there's like enough here to keep coming back to. I really like Screaming Life, but even then, like, I think that they would build upon their ideas here in some more interesting circumstances. Now let's go ahead and start ranking their albums proper. The interesting thing about Ultra Mega OK is that when there are songs that come up in the track listing that I like or think are like an interesting sort of proof of concept for the band in general, and sort of like laying the sonic foundation for them a bit more strongly than on Screaming Life and Fop. Those highs come in the form of like the opener Flower, which drowns the listener in this hazy, psychedelic, stoner-fied start that I think has a really solid groove beneath it. But after that first song, there is like a stretch of just a lot of kind of monotonous nothing that kind of plods for the first, chunk of the record. Like, Flower's a great start, but like having these two interludes with Beyond the Wheel in the middle is just a stretch in the record that I don't think works, and I think it's kind of a waste of the listener's time. I like the idea of them really slowing it down and dipping into some fun guitar play, but like, they've done that shit better within songs on following releases. I think that Mood for Trouble really cuts through like a fucking sonic knife, honestly. I think that like frantic acoustic guitar really just ramps up the record and sets off for a couple songs that I think is like a nice little stretch from there with Circle of Power and He Didn't. I also think that Nazi Driver is this really tight bass-driven song that I think gets into some seedy attitudes that, again, taps into a songwriting style that they would do more and sort of in a better way on future releases, but it's an interesting sort of genesis of that idea here. This record, honestly, just is sort of a victim of, again, the band just sort of like finding their footing and just stumbling a little bit along the way. There's some interesting fruits here. If you like some of their earlier records, if you like some of the ideas on records like Louder Than Love, or even Bad Motorfinger, if that's the only Soundgarden record you've listened to and you want to hear it in like a much more raw Genesis and a more bare bones Genesis, this isn't a bad place to go. It's got some moments that really enhance on and build upon that sort of bluesy roots and sort of help lay some sonic foundations that are like proto-grunge, but they would definitely go whole or hog on that on the next album. It is a cherry-picking experience, in my opinion, and again, a place of morbid curiosity, mostly if you're wanting to hear the band just really kind of try to hammer it out. For as much as I love Soundgarden, King Animal is a record that I had not ever spun until it came time for me to actually sit down and revisit this band's discography for this video. Even though I still loved Soundgarden to death in 2012, I didn't spin this. I did see some of the reactions to it, and that could have been some of the reasons why I stayed away. It is sort of a tragic last piece of their discography, in my opinion, especially on the other side of it. But even in that breath, that tragedy isn't in the quality of the music. I honestly think that this just kind of feels like a rock album by a band from the 90s made in the 2010s. It's got a lot of the same sort of production styles that I feel like them and some of their contemporaries like Pearl Jam were sort of skirting the lines of and flirting with during this era. But the lyrical sheet of this doesn't read like a comeback meant to say goodbye, a la like a thank you for your service. It more feels like a reignition with the hope of pillaging on. There is equal parts of this sort of like basking in one's own age, like on the opener Been Away Too Long, or on tracks like Bones of Birds and Tayri. Hell, it even dips into sort of reimagining ideas that were sort of fizzled out once the band initially broke up, like on 1,000 Days Before. Reworking of some of the inspiration that they were doing in the 90s. It was sort of a backbeat, an idea that Kim wanted to sort of hold on to and had started working on back when they were making their last album together, and sort of has this new life in the spirit of this album that helps sort of like show them and their growth from where they were to where they ended up. Like, Blood on the Valley Floor, with its, nice stomp to it, has the energy of wanting to march along and really enjoying being back in it with the hopes to sort of keep going. Or at least that's how it reads to me. Black Saturday has this reflection on life, but it very much is one of observing consequences and one of still wanting to make the right choices to go on for much longer, which, considering where Chris especially ended up just a couple years after this record, it's really bittersweet to see the band really craving life, only to have this be the last point in their career. It is a really solid record, though. I feel like if you love the band and you haven't spun this album like me, I very much would give it a shot. I wouldn't say it's like a stepping stone or a point of, morbid curiosity or even a cherry-picking experience. My issues with this are less from the songs and more from just the composition, the sequencing. Some of the songs I think aren't as good as others that they had released in the interim when they first reunited prior to this album's release. There's some real fieriness on here, but there wasn't quite as much as I was hoping for. But again, that also kind of helps it lend to feeling like a record from a 90s band made in a later point in their career. This is one of those records that I honestly could see myself making a redacted of at some point in the future. But it is one of those albums that I think, again, is a bittersweet punctuation. It's got a lot of good ideas, but its sonics are the biggest holdback for me outside of some of the later in the album moments. It is one of those examples of a band proving they could still cut the mustard, but not having the opportunity to capitalize on that and even build upon it in ways that I feel like they really could have. Now, part of me likes some components of King Animal more than Louder Than Love, but I think as far as, expanding on their bluesy grunginess and their love of psychedelia and sludge and actually making an album out of it, I think Louder Than Love is still a more solid spin as a whole. I think that, it's a bit less smart. It's a bit dumb. And even when it tries to speak on stuff, it's not quite as well done as it is on tracks like Non-State Actor from King Animal, or even a Worse Dreams. But I think the production on this album is a really good peak of late 80s, early 90s alt-rock, especially when that genre was still really trying to morph as the decade was coming to an end. Gun isn't really the best written song by the band, and I really don't think tracks like Full On Kevin's Mom or Get On the Snake or Big Dumb Sex rank amongst my favorite Soundgarden songs. But tracks like Hands All Over and Loud Love lean into that horniness a little better, in my opinion, and are some absolute ragers. Power Trip is the sort of meltdown that I feel would hit better if it was following a better written song than Gun, but is still a really lovely track. I love the guitars on that song, and Chris is just wailing his ass off too. And even if I don't necessarily love the writing on Full On Kevin's Mom, I think that the bass play and the drums on that song are sick as fuck. The same for I Awake, but that song goes into a realm that I think works better than some of the horny stuff on here. Same with No Wrong, No Right. There are some great points on this album, and I feel like it is a good stepping stone in the discography of sorts. If you like Bad Motorfinger, but you've never gone too early Soundgarden, I would start here, see how much you like, and before venturing forth through their debut and early EPs. But this is a good sort of next step for them. It is the sort of quintessential point I feel like most bands should reach, at least for a sophomore outing, if not better. But Louder Than Love is a pretty solid album in my opinion, and I think that its sounds really are a better showcasing of what the band would present throughout the 90s than Ultra Mega OK. It's just, it's not as good as their 90s stuff in my opinion. When it comes to bands capitalizing on a CD's length or the limits that the CD format provides, I feel like very few bands capitalized on that length in a fruitful manner quite like Soundgarden did in the 90s. You know, I sort of compare it to my love of the highs of a band like Avenged Sevenfold and how well they used the format to create these engaging back and forth records that take the listener on a really enthralling, you know, journey. Down on the Upside just happens to be my least favorite of the three 90s Soundgarden albums. And that's mostly because the back and forth, so to speak, or the ebb and flow, the emotional flux, while not necessarily as overt sonically, there's a real underlying sense of departure in some of the lyrics here, especially on the moments where the band does explore less positive realms. You know, the idea of Pretty Noose being the opener sets that kind of stage. Pretty Noose. It is an inviting death. And that sort of comes back out on some songs like the single two-piece in the middle, Blow Up the Outside World, and Burden in My Hand. This album's own proverbial Black Hole Sun into Spoon Man moment, but not as steeped in some heaviness because this album just isn't really trying to focus on being heavy. It feels like the band's slowing down sonically too, which, you know, leads to some fun psychedelia, and the moments that they do ramp up the energy do stick out more. Like Dusty's sleek guitar lines really punch through at the point of the record that they come in. Never Named does the same thing, following the mellowness from Blow Up the Outside World and Burden in My Hand. It's almost like a nice ramp up from those three songs. And honestly, it sort of at least adds something less bleak following Burden in My Hand and Blow Up the Outside World. But even like some of the darkness underneath, like Never the Machine Forever, really hit like a really uneasy underlying tone, especially again considering the band kind of broke up following this album's release. At the end of the day, though, this album is still a pretty damn solid release from the band, and I think that like its issues are less in the vein of pacing, which would sometimes be my issue with a record like this, and it's more just like the stark contrasts. The real highs and lows really sit in a weird realm for me comparatively. I almost compare it to how I feel spinning Beats, Rhymes, and Life by Tribe Called Quest. It's got all the elements that I like from Soundgarden. It's got really good production. The songs are really good songs, but like with the more sincere feeling bleak songs that do creep into the track listing, they make the more optimistic feeling songs, or aiming to feel optimistic songs, I should say, that the band themselves are trying to like pitch as like, yeah, we're really going in a positive direction, like on Ty Cobb and the like. They feel all the more dishonest and make like for a really jarring listen. Like you're kind of getting a peer behind the smile-laced curtain, and it almost makes you want more of that. But again, the album is still so good that it ends up sort of in the middle of their discography for me. If you haven't listened to Soundgarden, I wouldn't necessarily start with Down on the Upside, but if you've liked the sounds on the two records above this that I would say are better starting points for the band, and you can really do with spinning this. It is an interesting like slice of the discography, as is King Animal, because this was meant to, this almost feels like it was meant to be a sort of conclusion to the band with some of those undertones. But to see them bridge some of the ideas from this and reignite them on King Animal, make this almost a stepping stone of sorts. It's got the spirit of their you know, golden age, but has the mood of some of the points of an ending really would be. But still, really solid album, just not the best in their discography. So you wear the trophies, the grass is always green. This is a bigger conflict for me than I feel like most rock bands that I like, but I'm really genuinely torn because I think Bad Motorfinger and Super Unknown are the ultimate pairing that bridges the sonic identity of this band. I'm putting Bad Motorfinger in the second slot mostly because I much love where they take their sound on Super Unknown more than where they bridge the gritty rawness from Louder Than Love to the next album on here. It has some insane shit here, though. I think that, like, the guitar play on this alone is just c'est magnifique. Rusty Cage's riff really ignites this record in a fire that I think they carry you through with such beautiful splendor. He really is gonna break his rusty cage and run. When it comes to, like, sequencing, the bangers out the gate from that into the stomp of Outshined, which has almost like a trademark time signature groove for this band, just done so perfectly. The fact that, you know, you've got these sinister but lower key bass driven moments, like on Slaves and Bulldozers and Searching with My Good Eye Closed, really act as these good meltdown pieces for the listener to sort of stew in before they're thrust back into the madness, like on tracks like Jesus Christ Pose, an iconic Soundgarden song that when you're talking about, like, drum and bass play weaving together magnificently on a kinetic-ass song, that is, like, a peak version of that. I absolutely adore this album. I feel like if you aren't listening to Super Unknown to get into Soundgarden, you should be listening to Bad Motorfinger. As far as, like, keeping themselves steeped in the grunge sound as it was, like, really taking shape on here, but letting their identity still stand on the forefront, I feel like this does it more than and better than any of their contemporaries were doing during this era. You know, yeah, it's got some love of blues that comes through on some of the tracks that I already mentioned before, or on, like, Mind Riot or Room with 1,000 Years Wide. The groove and the guitar on that song is, like, quintessential grunge, but there's a heaviness beneath that, thanks especially partially due to the bass work, that I think makes it in its own metal-inspired realm that, like, sure, grunge was toying with and Alice in Chains were doing so in some of their records, but, like, this just sits in its own heavier sinisterness altogether. I also think that, like, them more focusing on a serious lyrical palette throughout the record makes for a more enticing listen. You know, they really get direct and bitey with it, like on Jesus Christ Pose or on Holy Water and New Damage the Closer, that I think show a maturation of their songwriting that I absolutely love as well. This is, like, just an incredible, essential 90s rock album that, again, if you aren't listening to the album that I'm putting in the number one slot to get into the band, you should make it this. It is an absolute incredible smash of an album that I've really loved revisiting throughout this before the review process personally. I held the opinion for a long time that Bad Motorfinger was my favorite Soundgarden album, and it wasn't until I got older and I kept both these albums in my relative rotation, my consciousness, that I sort of elevated Super Unknown above it, and it mostly came in the fact that they, again, created this, like, CD-length rock album that saw them adding bigger scale and dramatics to their heaviness, and, you know, again, that maturation of their songwriting that makes for some just poetic beauty and a lot of really good turns of phrase. When it comes to, like, songwriting in a rock album, this has some really good concepts or just really good ideas that I think the writing helps make it an absolute iconic slice of 90s rock ephemera. Black Hole Sun alone is, like, it's one of my go-to karaoke jams, which I don't do karaoke much, but, like, this would be one of the songs that I would love to bust out. I think that it is a song that embodies, ironically enough, what I feel like a band like Anamanaguchi were trying to tap into on a song like Magnet when it comes to, like, making a Batman rock song. This has some of the same components, but, like, just channeled into this absolute classic, quintessential alt-rock song of the 90s. The fact that it and Spoon Man act as like the middle of the album sort of crescendo amidst the more longer, sludgier, rooted tracks like Head Down and Limo Wreck, which get wrapped up in the more psychedelic influences, but still having this just meaty production that lets those textures just bleed into the listener magnificently, is genius sequencing. I think that, like, the start of the album with the stretch of the just nasty Let Me Drown before, getting the listener caught up in their wave, and giving the listener this great single and just catchy-ass moment before getting even more catchy but personal with it on Fell on Black Days is c'est magnifique. The stretch of The Day I Tried to Live getting fired up after that with Kickstand that gives way to another just kind of gritty, grungy, sludgy song on Fresh Tendrils is a really great moment as well in the sequencing. There's a back and forth on Misery and Pain on here that I think also dances with the listener and looms over them in a really beautiful way. I love this album. I think that it is beautifully haunted and dark, and I like the sonics and how they pair with that darkness and create this just grand experience for the listener to bask in the misery. I think it's easily the best album in Soundgarden's catalog, if only for sheer showcasing of dynamics from their roots and showcasing them reaching an apex in their sound. It doesn't get any better than Super Unknown, in my opinion. Absolutely love it. Again, if you aren't listening to Bad Motorfinger to get into Soundgarden, I would recommend Super Unknown and branching out in both directions from there. Those are my thoughts on Soundgarden's discography. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know your thoughts, favorite songs, favorite record by the band in the comments down below. Again, if you liked this video, make sure you liked it. And if you want to see more, consider subscribing. I drop 2 to 4 vids a week, depending on what I've got going on. I'm going to go, though. Thank you again so very much for watching this. I've been Viral Rack. You guys have good days, lives, and situations, and I'll see you another day.